This week on Reverberate, we're looking at Solomon's understanding of the afterlife. Solomon says that what happens to people and animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. So, what does that mean? Is Solomon denying heaven? Is he saying that humans and animals are no different? Or is he just pushing us to face the limits of what we can see under the sun? In this episode, we'll talk about death, the afterlife, human limits, and why Solomon keeps bringing us back to this humbling truth that God is God and we are not. Let's get into it. Ecclesiastes 3:19 says, "For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity." So, I thought we go to heaven when we die? Or what's this passage saying?
Yeah, it's a hard text. The translation's hard, and then even once you get it translated, the interpretation is pretty difficult too. It's not that hard to see what Solomon is doing at a real high level, that he's speaking to the fact that human bodies die and animal bodies die. Clearly, that's true. He's making that comment, which means ultimately you can't guarantee something that happens 200 years after your death because your body's not going to be around. So at the real high level, he's doing that. It's also, there's several different ways you could view what he's doing here. One would be to start with what I just said, the observable outcome. If you're walking on Earth, the observable outcome of a human dying and a dog dying is the same. The body dies, it stops moving, and eventually it decomposes unless artificially preserved somehow. And you could say what he's doing is arguing that the observable outcome is the same, but verse 21 says, "Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth?" Translation question, is that a rhetorical question? Is that a real question? When he says who knows, is he implying he knows an answer? Like all those, there's a lot of questions, but at least because he talks about the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of beast goes down into the earth, then he could be saying the observable outcome's the same, but verse 21 shows that there's a difference in the immaterial body. That's a possibility. A second possibility, he could be saying that he really doesn't know what happens after life, which could be similar to say, just from what I can see under the sun, I don't really know. Some people have argued that Solomon is the author here, or perhaps they don't think Solomon wrote it, but whoever they think the author is just saying, I really have no idea, and that's all that he has, is he doesn't know what happens in the afterlife. That's one possibility. You could be saying, if verse 21 is not a rhetorical question like, who knows, meaning nobody knows, it could be that he's implying God knows, ultimately, which would fit with the book in that sense that he certainly has said God knows some things that we don't. So it could be that he's saying, we don't know that information, only God knows that. So if you're going to make any conclusions based on an afterlife, you're going to have to trust God for knowledge about it because you don't have a way of finding it yourself. And then the other possibility, because it does say in verse 20, all go to one place, like you said, it could mean that all animals go to heaven in some capacity. That's really your four big.
So all dogs do go to heaven.
It could be that something that he's saying that, and that's your big picture conversation, is he's doing one of those things. Now, many of those, if you were to say the observable outcome's the same, but there's a difference in what happens to the spirit after death, I would argue that throughout Scripture that fits. Whether Solomon's saying that here or not is a different question, but it does seem like that's true. There is a difference. Humans are made in the image of God in a way that animals are not. Humans are talked about in Scripture as having soul, spirit in a way that's different from what an immaterial part, in a way that seems different from the way animals are described. So that's probably a true statement scripturally, whether or not that's what he's saying here. He could be expressing that he's agnostic towards the afterlife. I don't think that's likely, just because of the way he talks throughout the rest of the book. He gets to the end, says, remember your creator, fear God and keep his commandments. This is the most important. It sure seems like he's saying there's something beyond just life under the sun. He seems to think that. So I highly doubt that he's just saying, I don't know. But he could be saying, I can't know simply by scientific observation. That would make some sense. I do think he thinks God knows. I don't think that's the best way to think of this text, because when he says, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward, it's a pretty hard reading to make that say, God knows. That's what I meant. Maybe. but I doubt that. And I think verse 21 seems to give you the sense that there is a difference between man and animals. He's saying, look, we can't know it, but we all assume it, I think is what that verse is about. So if I were to really, I wouldn't argue with a lot of people on it. I'd say it's interesting, different views. I'm like, maybe. But I think the one that makes the most sense to me is that he is saying 2 points of similarities. Humans and animals both die, and human and animal bodies both decompose. I think he's saying those 2 points of similarity. I think the implication going with when he says, I'll go to one place, I think that he means decomposing, like dust returns to dust. Then when he which is what he says in the rest of verse 20. So then in verse 21, I think what he's doing is basically just saying this is outside the realm of scientific observation. You can't know. You're going to have to trust something beyond you in order to know whether or not this is truly, there's really an afterlife. So I think that's what he's doing throughout this text. Does that answer the question of what happens with animals? Are there animals in heaven? No, it really doesn't directly answer it. If there's any implication, I think the implication is that there is a distinction, or at least Solomon assumes a distinction between the spirit of man and the spirit of animals. But this text doesn't directly tell you this is what happens.
Yeah, I'm just looking so this opens up a whole lot of questions of, do we trust that there is an afterlife? What does Solomon think of the afterlife, like you're saying? But his conclusion is, verse 22, so I saw that there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his law. So whatever he thinks about the afterlife, his conclusion seems to be just take joy in your work.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've talked about this before, but sometimes the conclusions that Solomon brings about in Ecclesiastes feel like not enough. It's just, yeah, you're going to die one day, so just enjoy your work now. And he's dismantling the looking at legacy or looking at
right
meaning. So is that kind of the only conclusion that he's trying to bring about in this passage? Or I guess, is this just a description of life under the sun, and this is how you view death with eternity in mind? Or is there, I guess, something deeper we're supposed to pull out of this passage?
Yeah, I think going back to where he comes from helps us a little bit. He says in verse 18, I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. Now, the contrast there, I think his point isn't think of yourself like an animal specifically. I think the more important contrast here is remember you're not God. He's not trying to draw where the distinction is between humans and animals super strongly here. He's trying to draw the distinction between creator and creature. So when you have things like he's going to do right after this, I saw oppressions, I saw evils. Why is there difficulty in a fallen world? Partly so that we remember we're not God. Adam and Eve did not remember that. In one sense, they did, but they didn't remember that was good, and they needed to stay in submission and trust to him. They took on themselves, I'm going to judge what's right and wrong for myself. When they did that, evil came into the world, right? So sin communicates evil, difficulty, suffering is a parable to say, don't forget, you're not God. If I could always control my future, do good things and good things happen, then I would start to think I was pretty good. I can handle this. Just do good stuff. I'm going to be fine, right? Again, I'm reminded sometimes I do good things and bad things happen. What does that remind me? I'm not God, because if I were God, I would have done it differently. So you have this sense throughout the overall conclusion. Yes, 22 gives you a conclusion, but I think he states a thesis statement at the front that helps too, to say the point is you're part of creation, not a little God. Ultimately, you're on that end because you die. Your body decomposes, right? That's the distinction. God doesn't die. God's body doesn't decompose because he doesn't have a body in the Old Testament context, right? And then even when Christ comes to the cross and he does die, he doesn't stay dead, right? And he does that by choice. This sense of like we have something different between God and us that frustrates our control, it's vanity, is that I eventually face death and my body decomposes. So then when you get to verse 22 in that conclusion, I saw there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work. Maybe a helpful picture if we think about, not that I'm saying this is healthy, but we often think of work like I'm going to work really hard. Maybe I'm going to spend the strength of my body or the energy of my mind. I'm going to work really hard, sacrifice all this life, build up for retirement, essentially. And the reason we think all these sacrifices and this work is worth it is because of this guaranteed thing coming. And we could do the same maybe from a spiritual standpoint and think, well, I'm going to sacrifice, I'm going to work because there's this good thing coming in the afterlife, which is biblically true. And there's some good points there. But Solomon's point here is to say, just look at what you can observe. Look at under the sun. If you don't trust God for the description of the afterlife, you'd better rejoice in your work now, because one day you're not going to be able to do any of it. And you're not guaranteed anything past that if you only trust what you can see. I think that he's really just attacking those 2 points. You're not God, you're part of creation. And if you only trust what you can see, there's not much to trust in past this because you can't see.
Yeah.
So really the limit of human knowledge more than telling us the whole description of what happens after death.
That's helpful because it's, like we talked about, it's a confusing passage. And okay, so what is actually his point? And that's a helpful clarification of we are not God.
Right.
And it's also interesting just to think of this in contrast to earlier when he says that God's put eternity in man's heart. And so this feels like he's put eternity in our heart, but then here he's calling us to look on the brevity of life.
Right. Yeah. Right. I think eternity in our heart, we have a longing for something lasting. I think that's what he's saying. We have this in our heart, in our deepest desires, like, I want something lasting.
Yeah.
And then look at, but my body is fleeting.
Yeah.
And that contrast, like that drives a lot of Ecclesiastes, is this internal desire for something that lasts. Where can I find it?
Yeah. And then going back to the idea of pursuing legacy is we're trying to make something that lasts because of that eternity in our heart.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess another question regarding this. So there is some speculation and some what understanding of the afterlife did Solomon have? And there's different interpretations, but there is a possibility that he genuinely thought there was no afterlife, or he was just confused about it. So I guess if all scripture is given by inspiration of God, how do we balance this kind of thing where Old Testament authors have a different view of, in this case, the afterlife, compared to New Testament authors? If both authors were inspired by the same Spirit, why does there seem to be either confusion about conclusions or just seemingly different conclusions?
Yeah, I think that there's a debate, of course, in the Old Testament context where Jewish teachers, some believed in an afterlife like we would think of, a resurrection or an afterlife. Some believed in something much less like that, and there's a continuum there. So that is part of the debate, is what exactly is taught there. I think there's enough evidence in the Old Testament to say that there was a limited but real understanding of the afterlife, of a resurrection. You think of Job saying, I will stand on this, I will see my Redeemer. And there's other places where there's references that seems like they did understand a sense of resurrection. So what I would argue is that whatever Solomon understood about the afterlife for those who fear God, he did not understand the fullness of it, but I don't think it contradicts either. There is a sense of progressive revelation where people in the Old Testament knew some things and did not know everything. So once we get to the New Testament and we hear Jesus look at the thief on the cross and say, today you'll be with me in paradise. Paul saying, for me to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Or you look at those kinds of statements and you go, oh, this seems pretty clear in this context. Yes, the New Testament is much clearer about resurrection and afterlife than the Old Testament. I don't think that it contradicts it. We could have a longer discussion about what exactly that mechanism looks like, and terms like Sheol or Hades or Abraham's bosom or all these different phrases that get thrown around about the afterlife. So it is possible that there's two things that are possible. It's possible that the Old Testament believers had an incomplete understanding that is more clarified. It's also possible that there was a sense in which what happened to someone when they died in the Old Testament before Christ was actually different in some ways, depending on how you interpret some of those words. Because we often say, well, we use things like the lake of fire, or we talk about hell, or we talk about that language. But really in Revelation, that's pictured as a they're cast into that at the end of time. So did they go straight to it? Did they go somewhere else? Like how all that works out, I'm not sure God gave us a fully systematic way to work through all those things. But either way, we could say then two options when we look at the New Testament and the Old Testament and say those don't seem to quite line up. Either it's a fuzzy view that's clarified, incomplete view, let's say, that's clarified, or it is there was actually some difference in how the afterlife functioned before Christ and after Christ. That's possible, not contradictory, not in the sense like there was no afterlife and now there is, or something like that, but the actual metaphysical mechanism may have been slightly different based on what we see. That I just don't think we have enough information to know. When you think about the point that Solomon's actually making, I think it's fascinating to go into the next chapter, because then when he talks about injustice or evil or oppression or even death, which fascinatingly, many opponents of Christianity use those exact things. They'll say something like this: if God's good, if God's loving, if God's powerful, especially if he's all good and all loving and all powerful, then he can't exist because there's oppression and there's injustice. In other words, the reasoning they're using is basically, if I were all good and all loving and all powerful, then I would change these things. They have not been changed. Therefore, God must not be one of those things, or he must not exist. That's essentially the reasoning. The thing that really fascinates me about what Solomon does here is he actually goes the opposite direction and says, God has, actually, I want to back it up. He actually goes the opposite direction and says there's oppression and injustice in the world, in part so that we remember we aren't God. In other words, he flips it on his head. He says those things are there, and that reminds you that, in fact, you aren't God. You're not all powerful, because you would change it if you could. And the whole point then of this section, if you talk like 3:18 down through 4:3 or so, the whole point of it is to say one reason for evil, difficulty, suffering, challenges to exist in this world is that you remember you're part of the creation, not a God. And the reason that's true is actually the same reason an atheist points to that says, well, if I were all good and all loving and powerful, I'd do it differently. Yeah, you would. And those things are there to remind you that you're not in control of this fallen world. So it really drives us uncomfortably to recognize that difficulty, suffering, evil, death, all of these things, they're there to remind us we would do it differently. But God's actually God and we're not. And I think it's fascinating to connect all of those things together and to recognize, again, what he's doing throughout the book, which is to say, if you can control, guarantee your outcomes, then you would be God. And he just relentlessly, in this first part of the book, just beats that down. You cannot control these outcomes the way you want to because you're not God. And that's actually good news, because if I have to control everything, I'm going to be an anxious mess. And I'm going to fail at it miserably because I don't know how to piece together all those things. But instead, I get to do what he says: rejoice in your work, enjoy God's good gifts, do good. It simplifies that to say I'm not God, and that's a good thing.
I'm struck by the emotional depth and the logical complexity of Solomon's argument to get to such a simple conclusion of just enjoy God's good gifts and do good.
Yeah.
But there's so much weight behind that.
That's right. And that's important, though, because if I were to come and just tell you essentially the summary statements of Solomon's book, he says, the best thing for you, nothing better, right? The best thing, the good thing. Enjoy God's good gifts, so eat and drink. Enjoy your work. Enjoy the fruitful labor he puts before you, where you can influence something and you can do it and it's good. Enjoy it. Do good. Fear God. We're done. That's the summary. That's literally the whole summary. But that feels, if you didn't have Ecclesiastes, that could feel so simplistic. And somebody comes along and says, wait, but there's injustice and there's evil and there's sorrow, and there's all these things, and money looks really good. Maybe I should have a little more of that, or pleasure, or achievement, or legacy. If we didn't have all this other stuff, we would accuse Solomon of being simplistic and avoiding the hard questions. But actually, he goes through all these things so that he can get there and say, God's God and you're not. So it's simple, actually. It's freeing. That's the point. The more I try for control, the more my soul is tied up in knots. But we instinctively know I can't just say, whatever happens, and I don't know, I'm not going to care about anything. That kills us. We can't do that. So to have a way to say, there's emotional depth. I really do love what's good. I really do hate what's evil. I really do grieve. I really do rejoice. I really do all those things. And I enjoy God and his gifts in this life, knowing that there's more.
Ecclesiastes confronts us with what we can observe. Our bodies are temporary, and our control is limited. That is not meant to crush us, it is meant to free us. We are not God, so we can receive his gifts, rejoice in our work, do good, and trust him with what we cannot see. Next time on Reverberate, we'll look at Ecclesiastes 5 and Solomon's warning about prayer, words, and worship. What does it mean to draw near to God with humility instead of trying to bargain with him? And if Solomon cautions us to not bargain with God, how does this contrast with examples like Abraham pleading for Lot, or Moses pleading for the people of Israel, or Gideon asking for a sign? We hope you'll listen in.